Jesus drops the whole point of everything we're going to talk about today at the very beginning, verse 1 of this passage. Let's go back to it. Let me show you this one more time so we know everything that Jesus wants to tell us today. And he told them a parable to the effect. Before we even know what the parable is, he told them a parable to the effect. They are always to pray and not lose heart. That's the point. That's the point of the teaching. Jesus says if these disciples, against the backdrop that we know, are going to remain faithful in the interim, if they're going to remain persistent in their prayer, if they're going to remain an effective people because of their dependency on the Lord, despite what they're dealing with, they've got to be a praying people. That's his point. That's the point of the entire narrative. He says when it doesn't seem like God is listening to the cries of his beloved people in the midst of first century persecution, when Nero is lighting Christians on fire as stakes, actual torches, tiki torches for his courtyard, and their heads are on the chopping block, and brothers and sisters that they commune with in this time were being killed for their faith. And they're crying out to God, and they're saying, God, restore your kingdom. God, bring justice to us speedily. And it seems as though God doesn't answer. He says if they want to remain effective, if they want to remain a devoted people, they must pray. We've got to be a praying people. You see, what I love about this verse in this passage here is that it's an encouragement for you and I, because this is not just for the disciples. This command, this statement to pray always is for you and I. It's not just for the first century Christian, it's for you and I. You see, prayer is not the optional activity of the more committed. Prayer is not something that you can do when it suits you. Prayer is the Christian imperative that Christ gives to the Christian in the passage right now if we are to remain an effective people. If this church wants to be an effective church, it doesn't matter how awesome our programming is. It don't matter how cool Travis Ryan's beard is. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this church comes before God on our knees and say, God, you move. You build your church. And a church that's not on their knees will not be a successful church. A church that's not on their knees praying will be a church that closes its doors. That's what kind of church that'll be. But I'm so thankful for the vision of this church, that despite the odds, that despite how hard a culture, that we can have the vision to plant churches in post-Christian Belgium, in an area of Thailand where there are hardly any Christians. Why? How is it possible? Because this church comes to God and say, God, you move. God, you build your church. And I'm thankful for it. You see, prayer and our participation in it tethers our hope to the promises of God. Even though the outcome of our cries many times doesn't match the plea that we have, when we pray, it anchors us in the hope and the promises of God. And we're going to talk about how that is, but Jesus says from the beginning, he says, pray always so that you don't lose hope. He says, pray always and not lose heart. But what I love is that this isn't just a command, great leadership principle. You can never call anybody to go anywhere that you're not willing to. Right? You can never lead a group of people to a place you've not been. In Jesus, what we see in his ministry is that he was a person characterized by prayer. If someone was to describe Christ, you see it all through the scriptures. He was a praying man. Jesus would often retreat from the busyness of his ministry when the crowds, the multitude would follow, and Jesus would be in the midst of some heavy, intense, laborious ministry. He would often retreat. He would go to the wilderness, and Jesus would get alone and he would pray. He was a praying man. Jesus would, if you remember the story, right before he calls his 12 disciples, where was Jesus? He was praying all night. Jesus was praying on the mountain when he was transfigured before Peter, James, and John. And Jesus, the night before he gave his life on the cross for those who would put faith in him, was in the Garden of Gethsemane crying out to Jesus, so much so that it says that blood fell from his pores. He was praying fervently, repeatedly. Jesus was a praying man. Jesus prayed, and he calls you and I to do the same.